Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between Jon Edwards and Chris Manning.
So, John, you and I, the first time we met was at Maker Faire a few years ago here in Ottawa. But I think the first time I heard about you was through a podcast that you recorded with Guy English and John Gruber. That was shortly after the Apple Watch was announced, and the three of you had a conversation about watches. And started following you on Twitter shortly after that, and found out that you were in the same city as me. And so we met up that Maker Faire when I was showing off some of the things that I do.
Yeah, you toted out a Rose engine, which was very impressive. I don't even know how you managed to get it in there. It's the first time I'd actually seen a Rose engine in person, and you actually let me try it out, which I really appreciated. It gave me a newfound appreciation for just what it takes to actually use one of these machines to make primarily what I had known as just watch dials.
In fact, I had only just finished getting that Rose engine operational a few days before Maker Faire. So it was still new to me in terms of use, but since then, of course, I've done quite a bit of work on it.
So let's get a bit of backstory then. How did you first come to learn about engine turning? Or actually, even before that, for listeners who may not even know what engine turning is, entry level, what is engine turning?
Engine turning is interesting. It's a relatively old technique that few people are familiar with today. It was used a lot in jewelry work starting a few hundred years ago. And the pinnacle was probably at the turn of the last century with the work of Fabergé and Cartier.
Now this would be Fabergé and Fabergé eggs and whatnot, correct?
Yes, exactly. And that's the context that most people would know of it today, is if you think of the imperial the Russian Easter eggs that the Tsar was giving to his mother and his wife. That's a classic use of engine turning. These engines, in the not in the modern sense of an engine where it's a combustion engine. The Victorians called anything that was sort of mechanical an engine. So these are hand-driven, hand-powered machines that make it easy to engrave and do repetitive patterns on a piece. In the case of a Rose engine, you're doing circular work. In the case of a straight line engine, you're doing straight lines. And so it's essentially a way of easily decorating a piece of jewelry or something, a watch or a cigarette case, something like that, with a decorative pattern. And as well as being a decorative pattern, it also helps hide the wear marks of daily use. So 100 years ago, if Johnny Ive was designing a watch, he would not have left all the surfaces beautifully smooth and polished. He would have engine turned them to hide all those scratches that we pick up on things that are highly polished.
Which is patina now, on phones and whatnot.
Yeah, nowadays that shows the use and sort of the individuality of it. But 100 years ago, they were also holding on to things a lot longer. A pocket watch was something that you handed down to your children or your grandchildren. And so it needed to last longer. And so one of the ways that you can hide the, sort of those marks of daily use is to put an interesting pattern on it, a repetitive pattern that hides that. And that's one of the benefits of engine turning something, is that you do hide all those little scratches and wear marks of sort of daily use.
Just as a small aside, since you brought up Johnny Ive, just for posterity's sake, even though this won't be released until probably quite a while after that. Today, the day that we're recording, is actually the 10th anniversary of the original release of the iPhone. So I've been seeing all sorts of iPhones pop up with their aluminum backs all scratched up from just years and years of daily use. So it's been kind of neat to see that.
Yeah, it is interesting to see that, and it's again, as someone who designs things that are used on a regular basis, and hopefully things that get used for longer than what that original iPhone was used for, it's an interesting challenge trying to make something that you can use regularly and doesn't end up looking like it's been through the wars after a year. If you're making a pen or a watch or something that you want to last for 500 years. You don't want it to look like it's been tumbled through a sand mixer or something like that for a couple of hours. You want it to look relatively clean and unblemished for as long as possible.
Now, you mentioned pens there. You are well known for your pen making abilities, and you make some stunning pens. It's really beautiful, really well crafted pens that really could and more than likely will last for hundreds of years. How did that come about?
I've been a pen user most of my life. I started writing with fountain pens exclusively in high school. My hands would cramp badly during exams and writing long essays when I was writing with a ballpoint pen. And so my mom gave me her fountain pen that she wrote with in school, and that helped a lot. That made it so that I could actually write for hours on end and not have to not have hand cramps. Something most people don't realize about the difference between fountain pens and ballpoint pens. Fountain pens, you don't have to put pressure on the pen to have it write properly. With a ballpoint pen, you actually have to put pressure on the pen to make the ball roll to then deliver ink to the page. But a good fountain pen will leave a line without any pressure at all. So that's how I began using a fountain pen, and it wasn't for quite a while until I started making them. But I realized that I couldn't really afford the pens that I wanted. I was seeing these gorgeous pens that I couldn't afford. Also, I prefer a heavier pen, something that's a bit larger than the average person does. The other thing I realized was that most people who are making larger pens, they didn't have a very good design sense. The pens were poorly designed. They figured that just because it's bigger people using them or people with bigger hands using them, that they didn't need to pay as much attention to things like balance and comfort when you're writing with it. But it's still important. And all the pens that I design, I want them to be usable because I use them. These are all pens that I want to write with and that I do write with on a regular basis. So I sort of approached it from the point of view of this is something that I want to do better. So that's really how I got into making the pens that I do.
For my own curiosity, because I'm not a pen connoisseur, what do you consider to be a well-balanced pen? I'm more familiar with this in terms of nibs and things like that. What do you look for in a pen that's well-balanced?
Well, in the case of a fountain pen, there are a few different ways that you can use a pen. A lot of the vintage pens that are out there, they tend to be smaller pens, and so they need to be used with the cap posted on the back of the barrel. And that gives the pen enough length to be able to comfortably hold it in your hand. If you imagine holding something, let's say you've got like the stub of a pencil, and it doesn't go past sort of where the web of your thumb and index finger meet. It's very uncomfortable to write with that. You try writing with that for a long time. It's very uncomfortable. Whereas a pencil that's longer that sticks up past your hand is far more comfortable. So with a lot of the vintage pens, they were shorter in length, and so to make them sort of extend them out to a length that was comfortable, you needed to post that cap. The first thing that you have to realize is how long is that pen? Is it going to be comfortable in your hand with just the barrel of the pen? Or is it something that you're going to have to post the cap as well to get it to a length that's comfortable to write with? Now, I make pens that don't post. The caps tend to be too heavy, and so if you try and post the caps on my pens, the pen tends to jackknife up off of the paper a little bit, and it's uncomfortable to write with. Instead, I weigh the barrel of the pen forward slightly, so tips forward towards the paper. And that makes it a bit easier to write with and a bit more comfortable. All you need to do is guide the pen. You don't need to apply any pressure to the paper at all for it to write properly.
Right. So you said that the first fountain pen you got was from your mom. Do you remember what make of pen that was?
It was a Schaefer, and I don't remember which Schaefer it was now. Unfortunately, somebody walked off with that pen years later. I know one of the next pens I had was a Parker Sonnet that my grandmother bought for me. Those were really inappropriate for me. My hands are relatively large, and they were on the small side, so they were a bit uncomfortable, as I found out later on, compared to other pens. But they were what I knew, and they were better than the ballpoint pens that were out there.
Now, you mentioned too that around that time there were other pens you'd sort of set your sights on, but were out of your range in terms of what you could afford. What grail pens did you have, or do you have?
Well, it's funny. Later, it wasn't until quite a few years later when I started diving into the pen world, because what most people don't realize is that there's this deep, dark underworld of pens that, most people, they think about a pen and they think about going down to Staples or, finding finding relatively inexpensive pens, but if you start digging into magazines like Pen World, you'll find that there's quite a large industry of higher end pens out there. So I guess at the time, a lot of the some of the pens I was looking at were made by, let's say, David Oscarson or Yardo Lead, for instance, and they were doing higher end pens that are more like jewelry. They're decorative. They're also functional, and those were starting to attract my attention. And part of what was attracting me to those pens was that they were larger pens. They were more appropriate for my hands, and they looked great as well.
What sort of materials were they made from, those pens, like the David Oscarsons?
They're being made out of precious metals. So they were being made out of silver. Being made out of gold. Some of them had enamel on them. Some of them were being engine turned. Some of them were being engraved, and so they really represented more of the aesthetic that I was interested in as well. I was making jewelry by this time, and so I was intrigued by what other people were doing, and certainly were of interest to me.
So it was the jewelry making that came first, not the pen making?
Yeah, it did. The jewelry making came, I guess, around the turn of the century. I was living in Toronto at the time and in the IT world full time, and I was getting very frustrated. I was working on virtual computers. I was working on machines located around the world, and it wasn't very satisfying because nothing that I was working on was tangible, and none of it was sort of built to last. It was all being designed to be replaced on a regular basis. So a friend of mine was a jeweler, and she started teaching me in sort of evenings and weekends how to do basic bench jewelry work. Simple things, making necklaces, making rings, making brooches, all the classic things that a bench jeweler would learn how to do. And as I got more and more into the pen world, I realized that I could translate those skills as a jeweler into making pens, and that's when I started moving over into the pen world, and of course I began with the same way that a lot of pen makers do, and I bought the inexpensive pen kits that you can get from places like Lee Valley, and started turning basic pens out of wood and acrylic, and then from there quickly started making completely custom pens. So I guess I'd say probably within 6 months of turning my first pen, which was made entirely from a kit, I had built a pen completely from scratch, and the only thing that I was purchasing from anybody else was the nib itself. Everything else, the body, the barrel, the section, the cap, all of that, the clips, those were all things that I was making myself. Yeah, that's how I got started, was making these pen kits. But then that wasn't very satisfying to me. And again, one of the, we talked about design and balance and how a pen feels when you're writing with it. And one of the biggest problems with those kit pens is that they're very poorly balanced. They're not really well designed. They're designed to be made easily and assembled easily, but that leaves something to be desired when it comes to the actual function of the pen. And so they tend to be very poorly balanced is the biggest problem with them. And also you're very limited in terms of the diameters that you can make the pen. They're designed to work within a certain range of size, and so that's a very limiting factor with them. So it wasn't very long before I knew that I was interested in making pens, and B, that these kit pens were not going to satisfy me. I needed to get into something more custom than that.
So how did it feel to finally see a pen of your own design come together for the very first time?
It was satisfying. It was incredibly challenging, though. It took a long time to get something that I was happy with. Of course, one of the problems when you're designing something, and I think this is something a lot of people don't realize. It's easy to look at something that's been designed and say, oh, this isn't quite right and that isn't quite right. But it's more challenging when you're making it to say, okay, this isn't quite right, but how do I fix it? How do I make it better? And so some of my early pens were horrible. They were, they're much too large, or they were too long, or they were too short. And so it wasn't, it took a while before I had something that I was happy with. And same thing with little things like the threads that connect the cap to the barrel. a lot of people don't realize just what's involved with making a thread that closes quickly, so that you're not sitting there screwing your cap on for 6 or 7 turns to get the cap to close. You need something that'll close quickly. So it took a while to design threads that I was happy with, that would close properly and that I could make consistently. I remember that first pen that I did, that first custom pen I did, I designed the barrel and the section first. The section, for people who don't know, is the part at the front of the pen where you hold on to, just behind where the nib is. And so I had cut these threads on the barrel, and I loved it. I loved the shape of the pen. It was great. It was very comfortable. And then I think it took me another 2 months to be able to make a cap that actually fit the pen properly, just to get the threads working properly and the size of it. And it was a frustrating process, but it was at the end of it, it's extremely satisfying to have something that you've made sitting there in your hands, and you can say to somebody, "Hey, this is something that I made and I designed from scratch."
So this was all in silver?
No, this was in acrylic. I didn't. Prototyping, especially when you're making a lot of mistakes early on, you want to work in as inexpensive a material as possible. So I was working in acrylic at the time, and it wasn't until later that year that I started working in silver and doing that, because that of course brought its own challenges and difficulties. The clips were still being made, even on those early acrylic pens. The clips were being made out of silver. The bodies themselves, the caps themselves, those weren't. Those were being made out of acrylic.
Now the company that you produce your pens under is called Silver Hand. Where did that name come about?
The name came out of the fact that I was making things with my hands out of silver, and they were being made to be used by someone's hand. So basically a play on those two ideas.
When did you first introduce engine turning into your pen making?
Engine turning was there very early on. The clips that I was making early on were sort of a flat clip made out of sheet metal, made out of sheet silver, and the faces of those were engine turned. And so it was very simple. It was just a very basic straight line pattern that went up the clips, but it was there from the very beginning. And the first silver pens that I was making were entirely engine turned. And then eventually I went on to making some which had enamel on them as well over top of the engine turning. And since then I've moved on to being able to do work in other mediums as well. So there's a range of different products. Not all of them have engine turning on them now, but certainly engine turning is always something that'll always be at the heart of what I do, just because it's fascinated me for the longest time.
So what was your first hands-on experience with an engine?
First experience was at an OTI symposium. The OTI is Ornamental Turners International, and they're a group of enthusiasts in North America, as well as a few professionals who are trying to maintain these antique engines and maintain the art of not just engine turning, but also ornamental turning, which is sort of the bigger brother of engine turning. These engines that we use now for engine turning, they originally started as ornamental lathes for doing decorative work. So most people are familiar with the idea of a lathe, where you're spinning something around on its axis and then you're turning it, and so you get symmetrical shapes around that long axis. Ornamental engines were designed to be able to do odd things with that. So instead of just turning, a simple cylinder, you can offset that part, or you can index it and do things. Some of the earliest examples of those are the Coburg ivories, which are in one of the palaces of the Medici in Florence, and just absolutely stunning work. Just incredible what you can do with these engines. And eventually, people moved on from turning ivory and wood, and realized that they could start engraving metal, and that's where the engine turning sort of grew out of that. So, Ornamental Turners International, they're sort of a group of enthusiasts who get together regularly. I went down to their symposium. I had found out about them I don't remember how I came across them, but I had been doing research into engine turning for quite a few years at that point. So this is 2006 that I go down to St. Louis to the OTI symposium that was there. And I had never seen one of these engines in person, and had no idea how they were working. I had a book by a gentleman named Martin Matthews. A fascinating gentleman who from the UK. He was the 5th generation of his family who made watch cases by hand. And in the 80s, I believe it was, he wrote a book called Engine Turning, and it was a bit of a history as well as a bit of a introduction, saying this is sort of line drawings of what these engines look like, and these are the patterns that they make. And I remember spending hours going over these line drawings and trying to figure out how these engines worked, and it wasn't particularly obvious how they were working. And so the first time I actually was able to see some of these engines in motion was at this symposium in 2006. From there, I quickly realized that I needed to own one of these engines and start working. And I was fortunate through a gentleman in the UK by the name of Jon Edwards as well.
Coincidentally.
Yeah, this Jon Edwards was in the UK and was the president of the Society of Ornamental Turners there at the time. He arranged the purchase of an engine, a straight line engine that had been living in a jeweler's shop in Birmingham, and this jeweler was retiring and closing up and selling off his shop, and so John was tasked with finding a buyer for it, and so I bought this 1,100-pound straight line engine from England and had it shipped over here. It had been sitting in the shop for years and wasn't particularly good shape, and spent a lot of time restoring it and getting it back up and working, and then was able to start working on it.
Impressive. Now, an interesting bit of common history there. About the same time you were heading down to St. Louis for the OTI symposium, I had actually just heard about Matthews at the same time, and he actually, following his video, he inspired me to make my very first watch case. Which was not the most successful thing, as your early pens were, but certainly learned a lot from him, and just so impressed by the breadth of knowledge and experience that he has.
Yeah, Martin was fascinating, and I never had a chance to meet him. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. I know a few people who were friends of his, and he just had an incredible breadth of knowledge, and watching him work those videos. Anyone who hasn't seen them, it's worthwhile finding copies of those videos and seeing them. It's remarkable watching him work, and how sure he is of what he's doing, and not using modern measuring devices, and ending up with a case that fits perfectly with this watch that he's designing. He also did do a video on engine turning as well, and that was quite fascinating. I didn't find either of those until after that OTI symposium, but I had seen I'd seen his book, and that was what fascinated, or that's what sort of got me into figuring out what I needed to buy to start engine turning. I came into it. I became aware of engine turning, I guess, the way that most people did, through Fabergé eggs and seeing the work that Fabergé was doing. But it's funny because I remember my first experience with a Fabergé egg wasn't really Fabergé egg. It was one that was made for the James Bond film Octopussy, and those were not real Fabergé eggs. Like, they weren't original Fabergé eggs, but were in fact made specifically for the movie by a gentleman by the name of Jim Miller in the UK, whom I've since sort of spoken to and chatted with. But he made those specifically for the movie, and it's stuck in my mind as being fascinating. This fact that somebody could make something that was so valuable and was so beautiful. And so I later on, as I started making jewelry, I thought back to those, the images of the movie and also of the real Fabergé eggs that were out there, and wanted to learn how they were made. I was fascinated with the idea of how these patterns were being made and the enameling. So that's sort of why I became fascinated enough to then find Matthew's book on engine turning, and then that sort of led me to OTI, and then of course, now that's why I do why I engine turn the things that I do is sort of through that line of work, starting from that, as a child, seeing those images in in a movie.
Interesting. I actually had no idea that Fabergé had employed engine turning on the rigs until I met you. I learned that from you. My first introduction was actually through the work of George Daniels. He was the most prolific watchmaker of the last century. And the work that he did with engine turning, and then by extension, his apprentice, Roger Smith. And then, of course, a slew of high-end watch brands like Breguet and Vacheron Constantin and brands like that have watches that feature engine turning on them as well. Yeah, I had known Fabergé primarily for the enamel work and some of the fine engraving, or I guess you would almost call it carving in metal that they do.
Yeah, the watch world is certainly is the industry that has continued using it for the longest. They were certainly one of the first adopters of engine turning early on. Breguet was famously was using engine turning on his dials and on his cases, and using it not just as a decorative element. As mentioned earlier, not just as an element to hide scratches and daily use, but also as a decorative element on the dials. So you look at a lot of the current watches from people like Roger Smith or Breguet, the modern company, and you can see the direct lineage back to those watch dials.
And kind of looking ahead a little bit, I don't know if this is anything you want to talk about or not, but you've actually enrolled in the British Horological Institute's correspondence course on watchmaking and repair. What are your future aspirations there?
Yeah, so it's interesting. My love of mechanical devices predates my interest in jewelry making or pens, for that matter. When I was fortunate as a child, my family was primarily in the UK, and we would go back over to visit on a regular basis, primarily at Christmas. And I had a cousin who was maybe 15 years older than me, Richard, who was a collector of clocks and watches. He and his friends would often buy up antiques from an estate sale, and then they would split them amongst them. And one guy was interested in silverware, another was interested in furniture, and Richard was interested in clocks primarily, and so he would repair them and he would then resell them. And I remember staying in his bedroom as a child, and these dozens of clocks that were in various states of disrepair and functioning, and being fascinated with the workings of these little machines. And so one of the things I've always been fascinated with was the idea of making a watch. And so, as you mentioned, recently I've started going down that road of teaching myself watchmaking and trying to learn a little bit more about how all of the components are made, so that I can, in some cases, just repair the ones that I've got, because I do have some old watches that need repair, but also I'm hoping to be able to make one from scratch at some point, and be able to make my own watch. Now, whether that becomes another part of the brand, and whether that's something that I do on a regular basis or not, we'll have to see. I may finish my first watch and think there's no way I'm making another one of these. Or I may also, start doing more of them. So I'm interested in where that's going. It's if nothing else, I'm curious about about how these things are made and how they function. So that curiosity is really what's driving me towards that.
Well, having seen your studio for the first time just a few weeks ago, you're certainly well equipped to take this on. So I look forward to seeing what comes of it.
Yeah, it should be interesting. It's a fascinating journey so far, and it's far more challenging than anything else I've done, which is also driving me towards it. I love that challenge of learning new things and of trying to figure these things out. It's really what's driven me through most of my career. You'll see the average person who looks at my work won't necessarily realize that a lot of the things that I do are very experimental, and have not necessarily in terms of pushing the limits of new techniques or new materials, but experimental in that I'm often using techniques that people haven't used for a long time. And so I'm rediscovering some of the things, some of these materials and some of these techniques like engine turning. There certainly are people today who are doing engine turning work, but not a lot of them, and there aren't a lot of people who are writing about it. So, I bought this engine from the UK, and when it arrived, of course, it was in pieces and heavily rusted, and some parts were missing. And so the first thing I had to do was figure out how this engine was supposed to work, and then reassemble it and restore it. And then I had this engine that I had spent 120 hours restoring, and I had no idea how to use it. There were no manuals for it. There were no descriptions on how to actually use this thing. So I then spent the next 6 months engine turning and learning how engine turning worked and how to make the cutters that I needed for the engine turning work and the engraving and the pattern bars and things like that. So and that's just one of many things that I do where I've had to sort of try and rediscover how to do it. And so that's what I find remarkable about the watch world is, again, having these techniques that not a lot of people know about and not a lot of people talk about. And so trying to teach myself them and try and sort of learn them again.
I've caught one of your talks before, and I know you've given a number of other talks on sort of esoteric or somewhat lost arts and lost knowledge, or certainly information that's not widely available anymore. And the information that you provide through the experiments that you have done is fascinating. And hopefully that's some stuff that we can dig into a little deeper in future episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking about it. As you know, I recently spoke at a jewelers conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The Santa Fe Symposium is geared towards jewelers, and so I was speaking about an old technique that not a lot of people are doing anymore. Not a lot of modern jewelers are doing anymore, and so I'm sure we're going to get to that in another episode. We don't need to go into that now, but I think it's important to try and make sure that these old techniques don't die out. There's a place in modern design and modern jewelry work for old techniques. I don't think it's worthwhile being slaves to the original use of these techniques. I think that some of the modern engine turning, for instance, when you look at the work that Vacheron Constantin, for instance, is doing with some of their métier d'art watch dials are absolutely fabulous, and they're intentionally not doing what other people have done. A friend of mine, Rich Littlestone, he's a pen maker as well. Based out of Denver, Colorado. He's intentionally not using the traditional pattern bars that everyone else has been using. And so his engine turning designs are fabulous. They're so different than what the rest of us are doing, just because he's intentionally moved away from those classic designs. So I think it's important to revive these old techniques, these old arts, and figure out how to use them in a modern design sense.
What did you study in university? Just out of curiosity.
I left my university degree, I guess a year into it. I started a human kinetics degree at Ottawa University, and studying the human body and the way that the body worked, and studying it from the point of view of athletics primarily. At the time, I was competing as a triathlete and had been a competitive swimmer as well prior to that, and as well as a runner in high school. And so I was fascinated with the human body and how it functioned. I mean, really treating it exactly like I am any of the machines that I work on now. It was a fascinating machine to me. So I was doing that. I was also doing IT work as well at the same time, and realized very quickly that despite the fact that I was interested in the human body, there was never a successful career there. There was never a lot of money in doing that. And so the IT world sort of took over because I was able to make a good living off of it, even though I had no education in it. So yeah, I really have very little formal education in anything. It's I've got a high school education and a little bit of a university degree, and everything else I've taught myself along the way.
A true polymath and autodidact.
Autodidactism is one of those things that a lot of people don't really know about. I think famously Adam Savage from Mythbusters talks about it in his videos, and really it's that drive to teach yourself things, and I'm quite fortunate that I'm able to sit down and look at a thing and start to teach myself that thing if I'm interested in it. And it's sometimes a struggle and it takes a long time, but a big part of it is just realizing that if it's a thing that somebody's learned, then you can learn it. And so that's sort of how I treat the world is I look at the world and see the, sort of the interesting things that are out there and say, hey, I want to make that. How do I do it? I spend a lot of sleepless nights reading up on things, but that's also the reason why I make the things that I do.
Oh, fantastic. It's been nice getting to know you a little better, Chris.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. Jon can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.